Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this LexisNexis AI Insider webinar, The Future of Law, Grappling with Ethics, Security and Privacy in Generative AI. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Emma Dickin. I head up the in-house and the public sector practical guidance teams at LexisNexis UK, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's webinar for you. But far more importantly than me, let me introduce you to our brilliant panel members. First of all, to Jeff Jenkins. Jeff is the Chief Information Security Officer for LexisNexis Legal and Professional. Jeff has over 20 years experience leading cybersecurity teams across a number of different industries, including financial services, media, travel, and data analytics. I'd also like to introduce Jessica Clay. Jessica is a partner in the regulatory team at Kingsley Napley, and she advises on a range of SRA-related matters, including compliance with ethical standards and advising on law firm risk management, with a recent focus being on Gen AI and its safe and effective use within firms, which is very handy for today's session. As well as being in private practice, Jessica has also worked in-house, first at the Legal Services Board and then at the SRA, working in the General Counsel teams. She's also Deputy Editor of Cordery on Legal Services and sits on the International Bar Association's Regulation of Lawyers Committee. And last, but by no means least, I'd like to introduce Alison Woodis. Alison is Head of the Risk and Compliance Group for Lexis Plus UK. Alison is a risk and compliance solicitor, specialising in data protection and privacy compliance. Alison joined LexisNexis after nearly 20 years in private practice and currently leads a team of compliance lawyers and experts, providing risk and compliance guidance and tools for law firms, privacy professionals, and in-house lawyers. So that's the introductions over and done with. And without further ado, let's get going into the session itself. Now, before we get into the meaty questions of the day that you'll have seen set out in the invite, I'd like each of our panel members to just spend a couple of minutes doing a quick bit of scene setting around their respective areas of expertise to ground our discussions that we're going to have today. But if it's okay with the three of you, I'll start us off just by sharing a few high-level findings from the hot off the press LexisNexis report we've just published, which discusses the results of a survey we conducted last month, so in January, with over 1,200 legal professionals around their use of Gen AI. So just a couple of high-level findings to whet your appetite. Just over a quarter, so 26% of our respondents to this survey, so that's out of the 1,200 people, told us they're already using Gen AI tools at least once a month in their day-to-day work, which is a sharp increase from 11% who answered that question back in last July when we previously did the survey. 35% of all respondents have said they definitely have plans to use Gen AI tools in the future, which is a leap up from 26% last July. And the other interesting stat was we also asked people if there was anyone that didn't have any plans to implement Gen AI measures. Last July, 61% of respondents said they didn't have any plans to do so. That number has dropped down to 39% in 6 months. So we can see that there really is interest in taking advantage of AI tools growing. We also asked our respondents what sort of tasks they want Gen AI to help them with as and when they start using it. And the top 4 answers were to assist with drafting legal documents, researching legal matters, drafting emails or other communication-based tasks, or helping them to undertake document analysis. And the survey also revealed that whilst there's a lot of excitement around Gen AI in the legal market right now, and the fact that you're all joining this webinar is testament to that, it's fair to say this excitement is also accompanied by some concerns which people are wanting to have allayed, particularly around ethical implications, security matters, and trust in the accuracy of information that's generated. And we'll be touching on all of those points today, you'll be pleased to hear. And before I draw to a close, just to say, if you want to find out more about the survey and the report that we've published, take a look at the Lexis Plus AI Insider website and you'll find it on there. It's called Lawyers Cross into the New into the New Era of Generative AI. Enough from me, on to our panel members. That's who you want to hear from. So, Jeff, can I pass over to you to give a bit of a scene setting few moments from you.
Yep. Thank you, Emma. There are many security challenges. However, the underlying technology that's used for generative AI is not actually that significantly different. It's going to be the way that we use the technology that differs, and it's how it works in the underlying systems that actually create this variation of what we can actually do now compared to what we used to be able to do. So understanding how it's going to be used, what data is involved, and where that data is going, and then how that data can be used in the future is actually the bit that really interests me. I think you'll find more interesting elements outside of security and into the privacy and ethical side. So I'll hand over to Alison.
Sure, thanks a lot. From a data protection perspective, the two main questions are always, what's the law and what does the regulator expect me to do? The first thing to say is there is no specific UK law governing AI from a data protection perspective yet. So you mainly need to think about the UK GDPR. In terms of the regulator, early last year, the ICO, that's the regulator, published a toolkit called Generative AI and Data Protection Risk. Unfortunately, the title of that toolkit's about the only simple thing about it. If you download it into a PDF, which you can, it's 140 pages long. It's pretty techy, and not just from a data protection perspective, but also from an IT and a project management perspective. Fortunately, when ChatGPT burst onto the scene and into the public consciousness, the ICO followed this up with a blog, 8 questions that developers and users need to ask about generative AI. And I'm hoping we're going to find a way of dropping that blog into the chat, a link to that blog. The blog post is much easier to understand than the toolkit, although it does assume a base level of knowledge about the GDPR. So of these 8 things, it's simple stuff like, what's your lawful basis for processing personal data using AI? And how will you ensure you're transparent with people about what you're up to? So take a look at that. You've got to start somewhere with this. It is a good starting point. And as I say, hopefully we'll find a way of dropping a link into the chat. So I'll hand over to Jessica.
Thanks, Alison. Without stating the obvious, I think we're in a very fast moving environment at the moment with Gen AI. And in my view, this is going to require an adaptive and progressive approach from leadership across all sectors. And I think how law firms start to grapple with the challenges will be no exception to that. And the same will apply to lawyers working within those firms or in-house or indeed practicing on their own. From a regulatory perspective, I think a good starting point is what the government is doing. So they're taking very much a principles-based approach, and that's set out in the UK AI white paper. And there's a clear expectation in there that sector regulators really need to take the initiative and use their existing frameworks to work out how best to regulate and manage the risks around Gen AI in their specific sectors. So the legal services sector is a good example of that. It's probably helpful at this stage just to set out what the principles are in the white paper, and they're the ones that regulators should have in mind, I think, in terms of the safe and innovative use of AI. So the first principle is safety, security, and robustness. The second is transparency and explainability. The third is fairness. The fourth is accountability and governance. And finally, the fifth principle is contestability and redress. And I'll talk a bit later about what some of the specific legal services regulators are doing and the regulatory frameworks within which they have to operate. And how we use Gen AI safely and innovatively is absolutely captured within those frameworks.
That's brilliant. Thanks, everybody, for that quick bit of scene setting. And so I think we're good to move on to the first key discussion point of the day. And this relates to the potential risks, the ethical implications, and the regulatory complexities that are associated with generative AI. And Jessica, just to give you a heads up, I'm going to come to you first on this one, but you've mentioned the regulator, and Gen AI is rightly on the SRA's regulator, and we know it released a special risk outlook report quite recently about the use of Gen AI in the legal sector. And this report mentioned a number of opportunities that could come out of AI, but it also focused on some risks and challenges that it could pose. So could you pick out what you think are the key messages from this risk outlook, please? And then also thinking about an ethics angle, just spend a few moments talking about what you think are the potential ethical concerns or implications that those of us working in the legal sector should be looking out for.
Yeah, absolutely, Emma. So as you say, the SRA published a risk outlook report about AI more broadly. So that was in November of last year. I'd say that the report recognises that this is all quite new and everything is still a bit unknown. And when thinking about how to use Gen AI, they're basically saying that lawyers need to be seen to be pushing the boundaries, provide more innovative services, and provide different types of models for the services that they deliver to clients. But then there's an absolute need to balance that with a need to comply with existing regulatory obligations, including our ethical principles and codes of conduct provisions, which I'll talk about in a bit. So it's really trying to find that balance between being innovative, pushing the boundaries, but not forgetting the regulatory obligations that we have as regulated professionals. There's also another piece of guidance that the Law Society issued again in November 2023, which is called AI, the Essentials. That's more focused on generative AI, actually. And that very much helpfully reminds us as solicitors of England and Wales, or if we're working within, say, an SRA regulated law firm, we have to understand our regulatory and professional responsibilities. And that includes when we're providing services to clients. And this is absolutely no different in the context of using generative AI. And that could be, for example, Emma, either in internal process purposes where we're trying to drive efficiencies, or it could be using Gen AI in terms of providing advice to clients and the public. So I think it's probably helpful at this juncture just to perhaps touch on some of the particular regulatory obligations if we've got time. So
Sure.
Looking in terms of the SRA principles, so these are the ethical tenets of behaviour expected of us as solicitors, and indeed anybody working within a SRA regulated law firm needs to adhere to those principles. But I'd say the key principles, there's 7 principles in total, but the key ones in relation to using Gen AI safely and effectively would be principle 2. So that's about upholding public trust and confidence in the profession and in the provision of legal services. Also principle 5, which is acting with integrity. And finally, principle 7, so acting in the best interests of each client. So they're the main provisions within the principles themselves, but there's also some key provisions within the codes of conduct as well. So we have the code of conduct for individuals, that's solicitors, Ralls and Ruffles, but also a code of conduct for firms. And specifically, I would look to paragraph 3 of the code for individuals. And this is ultimately about providing services competently to clients. And it's about your general competency to carry out your role and keep your specific skills up to date. And that also extends to people that you manage as well. And there's also provisions in there about effective supervision and accountability. So I'd say they're the key provisions within the individual code. Within the code for firms, there is also provisions around competency, but I think more importantly, paragraph 2 within the code for firms talks about having effective governance structures and arrangements and systems and controls in place which enable you to comply with your regulatory obligations. It's also important to recognise there that there's a need to be accountable for work that's carried out by third parties, which would include contractors, which is very relevant here, and also 2.5 about identifying, monitoring and managing all material risk to your business. So that's absolutely key here in terms of risk management around the use of Gen AI. And finally, I would just say as well, let's not forget about the SRA enforcement strategy. So that sort of sits within the framework of rules and regulations. And here it's the key messaging around being accountable and being able to justify the decisions you take and exercising sound judgment when sort of assessing and making decisions.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And is there anything in particular you'd like to call out if anyone on the call works in a global law firm?
Yeah.
Is there anything different to worry about?
Yeah, there's this notion of regulatory divergence, and this is mentioned in the Risk Outlook report. So if you're working within a global firm, I think it's just very important to have in mind what different jurisdictions are doing and how sort of their governments might be approaching or looking to regulate AI. So as I've said, the UK government approach is very sort of light touch. It's very much principles based, and it's not looking to impose different rules on different types of systems, but it's allowing sector-specific regulators to very much take the initiative and work out what works best for them. But that's not the case in all jurisdictions. Touching on just a couple, China, Brazil and the EU, as we know, have gone more down the legislation route, and others are much more principle-based, as is the UK approach. So I think if you're working in a firm that is operating globally, just think about and be alert to these possible differences in approach, and understand what those differences might entail, and just make sure that you give clear information to those working within those offices in different jurisdictions, but also to clients, and make sure that that information is kept up to date, because as I've said, this is really, really fast moving at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. And is there anything from the ethical side? Obviously, there were some of the regulatory tensions you've just highlighted there. Are there just a couple of points perhaps you'd like to mention on the ethics side?
Yeah, I'll keep this brief as I'm conscious of time, but
Don't worry,
there are
fine.
obviously some ethical and bias concerns that could be present. So the possibility of large language models reflecting or potentially amplifying societal biases present in their training data and how those models learn, and that could potentially result in unfair or discriminatory content being generated. That's not to say that will always happen, but there is always that risk. And there's also this possibility of scaling up as well. So when using Gen AI, that much more content can be produced much quicker than, say, just one human who's working without using Gen AI, in terms of how quickly and how big that potential harmful content could get. And an important one for me that I mention quite often, but is the possibility for Gen AI to produce misleading, inaccurate or completely false output, which, you know, to us seems so convincingly accurate. So depending on the context, that could obviously have quite major ramifications, particularly if we're thinking about court proceedings, where liberty or someone's livelihood could be at stake. So there is very much a need for human verification and fact checking, and we remain accountable for that under our regulations. And I think it's important just to flag that we have already seen some cases coming out of the US where Gen AI has been used, and it's generated sort of false citations for case law, etc. So that's just something to have in mind, I would say.
That's great. Thanks ever so much, Jessica, for that. And I suppose the only other one to throw in the mix that we don't need to go into conversation about is obviously there's reputational risk as well, that we need to be aware of. So that's the regulators' take on things. Alison, thinking about this from a data protection perspective, is there anything in particular you'd like to call out around potential implications, etc.?
Well, I could hijack this entire session to talk about data protection risks, but I've been given strict. No, I know. I've been given strict instructions to stick to 3, so that's what I'm going to do. There are some obvious risks, some less obvious risks. Most people are going to be concerned about inadvertently breaching client confidentiality or inadvertently releasing personal data. So this could happen where perhaps a fee earner or a paralegal is using open source AI just to give them a little help on a client matter. So, improve the draft of this witness statement or letter for me, or here's a set of facts. What's the law on X? And you can't assume that just removing the client's name or even the client's name and address is necessarily going to help you. Information that your staff put into an AI tool will be personal data if it can be combined or augmented or cross-referred to other data to identify a living person. And in the context of open source AI, where data is scraped from the entire World Wide Web and it's processed by an AI tool that can make connections that our brains can't even imagine, the risk of identifying somebody is much higher. So that's my first one, and I know that keeps people awake at night. The second one is perhaps less obvious, and this is mission creep into the world of AI. And the data protection concept here is purpose limitation. So an example of this, similar, the ICO gives an example. So at the time you collected personal data and you identified your lawful ground for processing that data, it wasn't your intention to do the processing using AI. But now you want to use the personal data to train an AI system so that you can actually do the underlying processing more efficiently. You have to think about whether that's a new purpose. And if yes, you can only press ahead if the GDPR allows it. I have not got time to go into that. But all I would say is if you're thinking about using AI in relation to personal data, and AI wasn't in your field of view at the outset, you need to look at Article 6.4 of the GDPR. And for the reasons I've already covered, you can't just assume that, oh, well, we'll just anonymise the data or try to anonymise the data. You can't just make that assumption. My final risk is dealing with data subject requests. That's requests from individuals who want to access or rectify or delete their data. There are strict time limits. They're already problematic for law firms and in-house and data protection officers. The main challenges here are going to be, can you identify what personal data has been input into an AI tool, especially an open source AI tool, and how on earth can you extract or rectify or delete the data? So that's my top three.
That's brilliant. Yeah, there's not going to be much sleeping after this webinar, just thinking about those three, let alone the rest of them.
Yeah, sorry about that. I could go on.
Yeah, you're the fun one, aren't you, on this panel? I can tell. So over to Jeff to lighten the mood a little bit, she says, hopefully. If you were Chief Information Officer in a firm that wanted to deploy Gen AI or was already using Gen AI, what do you think would be the biggest risk from a tech perspective that would keep you with your tech hat on awake at night?
Yeah, well, it's always good when you're going to the security person to try and lighten the mood. That's not normally something that
won't happen very often.
So from a CIO perspective, you have a choice of either embracing Gen AI or not embracing it. And I think there's a real challenge for most CIOs that would basically say we have to embrace this. It is going to be a transformative technology. It is going to bring good, but it's also going to bring some bad with it as well. And that's just the standard facts of any new technology. It's what it does. From a CIO perspective, I'm looking at multifaceted role, and I need to really consider how it's going to be used to enhance our product offerings, how it can improve our internal processes, and how our competitors will be using it, and therefore ensuring that I don't get behind the curve against my competition. The big thing from a CIO perspective is how do we keep our data safe? So yeah, that's going to be the entirety of my thought processes, is how am I going to make sure that whatever technology I use, my data stays secure to the same level that it is at the moment. So I won't go into the details of how we would do that, but that's the kind of thing that would keep me awake from a CIO perspective. Obviously, I'm a CISO, so I have to look at it from the security side. And actually, the angle on that is somewhat different. My role requires me to ensure that I keep our customer-facing products secure, our internal environment secure, and the intellectual property that gives us a competitive advantage secure as well. So again, that comes down to our data. But the actual thing that would keep me awake at night is actually how, and I'll simplify it and call them hackers, would actually use Gen AI to increase their productivity, their effectiveness, and their timeliness. And that's because they don't really have to worry about ethics and privacy and all of the rest of it, and they can use it with impudence. And so that's the bit that really concerns me, is that their use of it will be much faster than our use in terms of protecting our world.
Actually, I take it back. I think you might have top trumped Alison after all that. Well done. Anyway, let's not talk about that one anymore. It's too scary. Let's go on to the second question point that we wanted to cover off today. And this is all based around sharing with our audience some insights into how legal professionals can protect their firms or businesses whilst reaping the benefits of this technological revolution. So, Alison, with your DP hat on, what insights can you give into protecting your business?
Okie doke. The starting point with data protection is always find out what's going on in your business. Who's processing personal data using generative AI, and what AI tools are they using? And probably the best way to find this out is just to ask people, but don't just go to them and say, What AI are you using? People might not realise that some of the open source tools they are using involve AI or generative AI. So maybe they're using publicly available tools to check grammar or help them write documents. They may not think of that as generative AI or even AI. So it's possibly better to provide some sort of a questionnaire, preferably anonymous. Are you using these things or anything else? You could also consider some sort of technological monitoring, so tracking external websites people log on to, but I haven't got time to go into the ethical and the employment law implications of that. And it's not my bag from a technical perspective either. So that's the first thing I do, what's going on. The second thing, educate, educate, educate. Your staff need to understand what is generative AI and how does it work. It probably doesn't work the way people think it does. If you can get, and I'm not going into that, but if you can get one message across, just one message, I would say it's this. From a simplistic perspective, your staff need to think of an open source generative AI tool as being like the global village gossip. It will absorb everything they tell it, and it will recycle and reuse it as it sees fit in its conversation with the next person that comes along. Once they've parted with the information to the AI tool, they can't take it back again. Like every good gossip, if it doesn't have the AI tool might just make something up, or it might just gild the lily. And when it does, as Jessica's already said, it can be very convincing. And I've actually seen that with open source AI, and I've been on the receiving end of that. And it really can be very convincing. And then when you poke it and say, are you sure? It just doubles down on the information that it's serving up to you. Number 3 is a quickie, but it's really important. Whenever you're processing personal data using AI, do a data protection impact assessment. It's a very clear expectation of the ICO. And the great thing about doing a DPIA is it will flush out all of the other things that you need to think about and you need to do from a data protection perspective. So I'm handing over to whoever is going next.
Brilliant. Well, that's the data protection regime covered off nicely in a few key points, but it's obviously not just that we need to worry about if we're running a firm or business. We've got that regulatory side, that additional layer that Jessica's already mentioned. So can I come back to you, Jessica, just to continue down what law firms or lawyers should be doing from a professional regulation perspective with regard to ensuring their firm or their organisation is protected?
Of course, I think this follows on really nicely from what Alison's just been describing as well. So yes, we've talked about the regulatory framework and the obligations, but I like to think of this more in sort of a broader, with a broader approach, and think about how clients manage the risk. And I say manage the risk in relation to the use of Gen AI and its safe use as you would assess any other risk posed to your firm, or manage this risk as you would as an individual solicitor thinking about whether or not to take a particular action in your day-to-day practice. So it's very much, in my mind, it's about compliance being part of the firm's culture, and the use of Gen AI, as I say, is no different, and it needs to be embedded within your general approach to law firm risk management. Thinking about this from a practical perspective, some of the key considerations, as Alison has said, a lot of this comes down to user knowledge and user expertise. So absolutely make sure those using Gen AI within your firm know what they're using, what its capabilities are, how to use it, and what its main risks are, and that will be different depending on the product, etc. And this also very much links to what Alison said about education and training as well, which are absolutely key. So when seeking to promote the safe and effective use of Gen AI in law firms, I would say always consider sort of the following things. And all of these are prefaced by a key word, which is usually what makes them successful. So in terms of systems and processes, these need to be robust. This could be your IT systems and processes, ones relating to AI, confidentiality, data governance, etc. And also review the data management standards of any third-party providers or suppliers in that respect as well. It's about not just having policies and policy statements around the use of AI, but it's also making sure those policies are effective. So they need to be living and breathing documents, not hypothetically gathering dust on a shelf. So we know this is fast moving. Those documents need to be kept up to date. And they also need to clearly set out what the firm's expectations are around the use of Gen AI in particular. So delivery of training, as Alison's touched upon, this is about effective delivery of training, and this is about having engagement with that training. So people are not just turning up. It's not a box ticking exercise. Think about ways that you can really grab their attention. So think about case studies, think about horror stories. I know it's not great, but often that is the best way to make something stick, is to talk about real life examples of how things can go wrong and how you can learn from them and make sure those sorts of things are not happening to you. I also think supervision, so having really effective, good supervision arrangements and models in place to make people feel that they're supported, and also that they're able to approach managers and speak up if they've got any concerns around how they're using these products, or any uncertainty generally, that there is somebody that they can go to talk that through with. And finally, a practical consideration. I think a key for firms trying to roll out these products is about having a diverse team, so a multidisciplinary team in place to develop your AI offerings, work out what your clients really want and what they are expecting from you in terms of the services you're providing. So by having that multidisciplinary team, you're promoting, I would say, cognitive diversity around the offering that you can give. So I think they're just some sort of practical tips around how you approach risk management generally. And I don't think that needs to be any different for the use of Gen AI.
Brilliant. And I guess the same rules always apply with anything to do with the SRA. It's just making sure you can evidence whatever you've done should anything happen.
Absolutely. And that goes back to
show,
the importance of strategy, accountability, and decision making.
Brilliant. Thank you. So Jeff, do you have any top tips about how Gen AI tools can be sourced, or how they can be deployed, that kind of tie in with the points that Alison and Jessica have just raised?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing, and this is a bit of reinforcing what's already been said, but you need to have a clear policy. What are you actually going to do? Are you going to embrace generative AI, or are you going to limit its business use? And if you're going to embrace it, then you have to train your employees in terms of how you're going to use it effectively, and also what not to do. So if you don't want it used as an alternative, then how much are you going to invest in preventing it? How much are you going to invest in tracking those that are trying to circumvent the system and actually still want to use it? Because there will be people that are doing that. And then how are you going to report it, and what you're actually going to do at the back end of that? It's really, really important to remember that Gen AI is a human efficiency tool, not a human replacement tool. So there is a requirement for us as individuals to validate and check the output that is generated from Gen AI. It's doing a really, really good job most of the time, but it still needs validation and review. And so as a legal professional, you need to know whether you're using a private instance, where the data you upload is only available to you and your business, or you're using an open source model. That once you put that data in there, it's there for everybody to use, as Alison said earlier. And that's a really important thing. Your role might not be in technology, but you have to have an understanding of how you are using this technology and a clear comprehension, because if you don't, that's a very dangerous thing, to have this power within your hands but no comprehension as to whether you're putting data in that's going out and being then used for everybody else in the world, or whether you're putting data in and that is still treated as though it's within your company's four walls and still protected. So if you're going to use Bard, ChatGPT, any of those open source elements, Gen AI pieces, then you're going to have to use it in a significantly different way to using something like Lexis Plus AI, because one is a closed loop system and one is very much open. So again, that's not to say you shouldn't use Bard and ChatGPT. You've just got to be very, very conscious about how you use it and what you're going to do. So again, think about what you're going to be using, where you're going to be using it, and how you're going to be using that. And the reality is that open source and closed loop systems are actually pretty much the same technology. So if you look at them in terms of the way they're marketed, they're going to be marketed in very similar ways. They're going to be the ability to do generative AI and large language models. So you actually truly have to get stuck in and understand what we're asking there. And then just think about what you're actually using it for, how you're asking those questions, how they're handling your data, how they're combating bias, how they're reducing hallucinations. And from a legal perspective, I think it's really important. How do they provide citations?
Brilliant. Some great points there. Links in quite nicely to the next question or discussion point for today, which is thinking about the sorts of questions. If you're going to want to explore using Gen AI in your own firm or business, if any of our listeners are thinking about doing that at the moment, what sort of questions should they be asking when they're thinking about doing this? So Jeff, you're on a bit of a roll, so why don't I just stick with you for a minute? So what are the top questions that you think our listeners should be asking when they're thinking about implementing Gen AI in their firms, and why should they ask these things?
I probably sound like I'm repeating myself, but it is going to be what type
If it's
of data
important,
will you
yeah.
be submitting to Gen AI?
Mhm.
So are you doing prompts for non-sensitive generic inquiries on the law? To a degree, who cares? All you're literally doing is a Google search, but using generative AI power. And what if your actual prompts include contextual references to get drafts on specific cases? Now you're getting more sensitive. I want summarizations of case law. Well, that's probably okay depending on what you're actually looking at. But then I do summarization of case law with direct contextual references to company sensitive documents. Now, obviously, you really are looking at, I need to be on a closed loop system. So your risk posture really can vary depending on what you're actually inputting and what you're asking. And so therefore your due diligence needs to change, which ultimately brings me to my second question. So what training are we going to give our employees, and what training will our service providers like Lexis provide to our employees? The way we use natural language-based Gen AI is completely different to the way that we did Google searches. You are asking conversational, contextual questions. It's not just a simple kind of like, where can I find the nearest hardware store? You're actually starting a conversation and really building upon it. So as an example, if I say, draw me a picture, I'll just get some random output. And that's fine. But if I say, draw me a picture that uses grayscale in portrait, and in this picture have a cat, the moon, and a large futuristic landscape, you're really going to drive a more targeted output. And ultimately, when you're thinking about doing that from a legal perspective, that's a similar sort of conversational piece that you want to get into. You're going to start from something very generic and then get more and more detailed in terms of how you drive that. So you've got to think not only about where you're going to start in terms of the questions you ask, but where you're going to end up. So actual training is really, really important. And from a business perspective as well, you're going to start getting into specific cases, potentially uploading documents, using people's names, because you really want to have something that's generated that's useful to you in whatever case you're going to be taking forward. So really, really think about that. The last question I would ask is, when you're using third parties to perform generative AI, you need to understand that third party's security, privacy, and ethical approach to generative AI. And verify that your data is protected appropriately and that your proprietary data is not used to inform responses that would be available to competitors or the general population. So again, it's a real understanding of who that third party is, what they're doing, and how they're using your data.
Brilliant. So it's very easy to see how you can start off with just thinking you've got to ask a couple of questions, and one question leads to another question, leads to another question. So it's something that needs to be given a lot of thought, rather than just jumping straight in by the sounds of it. Alison or Jessica, have either or both of you got anything you'd like to add on that with regard to questions people should be asking?
Happy to chip in, Emma, if that helps.
Fine.
Yeah. So I'd say In terms of types of trends we're seeing with concerns that law firms have around the potential use of generative AI products, one of the first things that often we get asked or we're discussing within our own firm is how can we be assured our clients' confidential information will remain secure? So that's a key question that we're all sorts of grappling with. Another question, what's the deal with intellectual property rights? Who owns what? Who owns the prompt? Who owns what's coming out of it? Again, probably throws up more questions than that one concern that I've just put, but that's another thing that we hear a lot about. And then finally, on a slightly different tack, how do we find the best products and the services that we need? There seems to be so many suppliers out there trying to get business from us, all trying to seize the opportunity. So what do we do? Like, based on our budget, do we push ourselves? What can we afford? What should we be investing in when so much of this is unknown? So again, that's another concern and a question sort of coming out of law firms, I would say.
Brilliant. And Alison, with your DP hat on, are there any other questions you think people should be asking?
This is not so much data protection, but it is one that the ICO talks about, and it has been mentioned, but I just thought I'd put a bit of context around it. It's bias. So I would want to know what steps have been taken to avoid bias, particularly where an AI tool is being used to make decisions that affect people, for example, in the employment context. And biased outputs can arise from two sources. So firstly, the data used to train the system was biased. And that can be the case with historic data, particularly in relation to employment, or the algorithms underpinning the system are biased. And the bias could be completely unintended, but it's just irrelevant. You need to know what checks have been made to ensure that the outputs are not biased, and also think about what checks you're going to make yourself to make sure the outputs are not biased.
Brilliant, thank you. Final point I want to pick up onto today is all around sharing some insights with our viewers with some real life examples of Jeff, and I'm going to come to you for this. For example, your experiences of working on our Lexis Plus AI product. What have you had to go through to ensure that, or what have we as a company had to go through to ensure that our data we're using is safeguarded and it's in the great place it is? Because the points that I guess we've gone through internally from our side are the same sort of points that people should be asking their own suppliers who are talking about other models, if they've gone through the same process, so they can get satisfactory answers. So could you just give us a bit of a sneak peek into the world of Lexis Plus AI from what we've had to get right to make sure we can cover off a lot of concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start by talking to Alison's point that she just made there about bias, and then transform that into hallucinations to a degree. But this technology was new to everybody pretty much. Artificial intelligence, it's been around for a long time, not a problem there, but generative AI really came to its fore in 2023. Understanding how hallucinations work within generative AI was one of the fascinating things that I learned. Literally within the large language models, within the technology we use, you can utilize a sliding scale that says how much do I want this technology to actually make up answers. And the primary reason for doing this was actually because if you provide the same answer over and over again, humans don't necessarily think that there's a lot of intelligence behind that. It's just an ability to repeat information. So if you slide that bar and say, actually, I'm open to having variations of answers, i.e. hallucinations, then you get different answers to the same question put by the same person. And that actually gives some confidence that actually what you're looking at is something that's been generated by an intelligent source, so i.e. generative AI. So actually within the LexisNexis product, we've got our slider bar set right down to the bottom. We don't want hallucinations. We don't care about having different answers to the same question over and over again. Unlike something like ChatGPT, we actually want precise answers and accurate answers represented within our technology. So that was just something that I learned last year, and it was an interesting piece, and I was trying to work out how it would actually do hallucinations. And the more you read on it, the more you find out about these things, and it's quite fascinating. In terms of the actual question around how we've done security and bias and hallucination around Lexis Plus AI, then we were actually all involved right from the beginning of this process. So that's, if you've ever been involved in technology, that can be quite surprising at times, to have your privacy team, your ethics team, your security team, your technology teams all involved right from the beginning and all working on a product right from the start. So that was really, really good, because it meant that we got to build this from the ground up, and we got to look at large language models, understand how we're going to use generative AI, and anticipate the questions that our customers might ask of us and expect of us. That's how we kind of got to that original point of the technology itself is not that materially different in terms of what we do before and what we do now. So from an infrastructure perspective, the security around it and the way that we handle it is not that much different than what we've done before. So if you're a customer of Lexis Plus, then Lexis Plus AI is built on the same principles around how do we protect the data, how do we secure it. In respect to the hallucinations, didn't say that very well, and bias, the way that we're actually giving you confidence in our responses being accurate is through our use of citations, which I mentioned earlier. We also employ a humans in the loop approach. So our subject matter experts, our data scientists and our engineers are fine-tuning these large language models. And we also use reinforcement learning from human feedback. Again, another thing that I learned around this, which was really, really interesting, what we do is we generate questions to then put to the large language model. We then get 2 answers back from that large language model, and humans go in and they rate which one is better. And then we continually train like that. So we're not actually using customers' data. We're creating our own prompts and engineering our own prompts, and then we're putting those in, and then we're basically training the model via that. So there's no customer data going into this particular large language model that we use for Lexis Plus AI. And then we also optimize these and fine-tune these for certain desirable behaviors and ensure consistency and quality as well. So if you've used this product, or if you get to use this product, you'll see that there's a thumbs up and a thumbs down, like social media pieces, so that you can easily rate whether the answer is good or bad. And then there's feedback loops within there as well. So we're trying to ensure that if there is anything that's actually not presenting the best answer for you, we can actually train that and develop that accordingly. I've already said we don't train our models on your data. We take your prompt in terms of the technical way that this works. We augment that with our up-to-date data, which is authoritative and comprehensive. That's why you trust Lexis. And then we provide you with an enhanced response. So we can also add greater value if we also add your documents to this. Now, again, that was another piece where initially when we launched, we didn't have the document upload feature because we had to do some more work on that and ensure that that was secure and protected. So we initially launched with just prompts, and then we moved to document upload. The document uploads only last for 10 minutes after your session expiry. So as soon as you can complete your session expiry, those documents disappear. Some of that is counterintuitive to a good experience. So you might, as an individual user, be kind of like, well, I've uploaded this document, I've closed my session, I want to go back and reuse that document. For the security of your information within your company, you have to then re-upload that document. We don't keep it, we don't maintain it. It has to go and it has to disappear. So again, that's another piece that's slightly different and slightly unique in terms of the way that we operate within these boundaries. We do all the normal stuff. So we secure your data in transit and at rest. So encryption at transit, encryption at rest. I don't know how many technologists there are on here, so I'm not going to go into what particular algorithms we use and all of the rest of that. But it's but we are using industry standard encryption and protection of where we actually do have your data, which includes your prompts. So we retain your prompts for 90 days, unless you go in and say, actually, I don't want this prompt kept, in which case it's up to you and you can delete it immediately. So it's 10 minutes for documents that you upload, it's 90 days for the prompts that you enter, but again, you can go in and delete those. And as I stated in my top 3 questions, creating prompts is a new skill set, and we help our customers through this with training and prompt guidance within the portal. When we have gone through this whole process, we have done a whole heap of work internally to try and work out what good prompts look like. So we're aiming to actually transfer that knowledge to you to make your use of our products far better as well. And then lastly, we've had third-party security testing, and they're in the process of a systems and organizational control audit, which is otherwise known as a SOC 2 audit. The UK quite often refers to ISO 27001 as its guiding principle. SOC 2 is kind of the American equivalent, if you like, and they do very similar pieces. So certainly from our company as an international organisation, if we're using a third-party vendor and they provide us with a SOC 2 report or a ISO 27001 report, then we're happy with those as a true assessment that the company has been reviewed and that their security processes are in a good state. So that gives us assurance that our security controls are designed and implemented effectively. And that's my kind of whistle-stop tour of Lexis plus AI and what we've done in terms of trying to make sure that we keep all of this data secure and provide really good value to our customers in terms of how we can use this wonderful new technology.
Well, I have to say I learned something there. I'm working for Lexis. That's saying something. But I think the point is that's just to give you all a bit of an insight into the process we've been through, and also to give you an insight into what you should be checking any other suppliers you're talking to, that they've been through the same sort of rigorous process, because without that, and I'm sure there's a million more things that Jeff and the team have had to do other than the ones he's shared, obviously you can't be quite certain everything's as it wants to be. And I think the key point that struck out to me there was, if you're looking to do it in your own firm or business, get the right people around the table at the start. So get security team, the IT team, the compliance team, all of those people to start talking from the get-go. So really helpful. Just conscious of time, but just very quickly, Jessica, do you have anything you want to say just to bring this particular question to a close around potential impacts you're seeing in your firm or other firms that you'd like to highlight, of things that they're having to think about around Gen AI? Just a couple of points if you've got any.
Yeah, I think I might approach it from a slightly sort of different perspective, but in terms of business planning, so kind of business planning and forward planning. As we've talked about how kind of this is still quite in the early stages and there's still quite a lot of unknowns and uncertainty. But I think in terms of business planning and future proofing, I think firms are thinking about their team structures potentially and what this might look like. Will this need to be different in the future? When, but I think I could say if, but I think more likely when Gen AI really takes off. So are we going to have teams made up of broader skill sets, different types of individuals, more knowledge managers, for example, but with, I think, still a sort of a layer of expert sort of human verification at a top level. So it's just very unknown, but I think people are thinking about what might our teams look like that are providing services to clients in the future. Will they be different? And also linked to that, I think from business planning perspective, will we need to think about different pricing models? Many law firms, are still sort of very much focusing on the billable hour. I think there really does need to be a move away from that. So thinking more about innovative ways of pricing for clients as well. So more fixed fees and how that reconciles with how we operate at the moment across the legal sector. So as I say, sort of more business planning considerations, but I think they are things that we have to think about in terms of how Gen AI could impact law firms in the future.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Well, I'm conscious we've only got a couple of minutes left really in the session because these people have got to get back to their busy day jobs, but that was a real whistle-stop tour through just those 4 talking points. And I'd really like to thank our panelists for sharing all of your respective insights with everybody. And I'm sure the audience will agree that you were fantastic. So thank you very much for that. So it just remains for me to thank you all for your attendance again and wish you all a good rest of day. Thank you for joining us.